"Women don't read wind," Master Warrant Officer Royce Bramwell said, loud enough that the whole left flank of the firing line heard him, and then he towed Wren Mercer's data book off the shooting mat with the side of his boot, the way a man flicks a cigarette, like the small gray notebook full of her wind calls and her elevation dope and 12 years of her grandfather's handwriting copied over in her own was a piece of litter that had blown onto his range. "Calculators read wind," he said. "Reservists read calculators." He laughed, and 4 of the regular force shooters around him laughed because that was the arrangement they had with him. Laughter in exchange for proximity, and the September sun came hard and flat off the berms at Connaught, and Wren did not pick the book up right away. She looked at him. She looked at him the way you look at a crosswind flag that has just told you something the near flag hasn't admitted yet. And that look bothered Bramwell more than anything she could have said, because it was not afraid and it was not angry. It was reading him, and being read was the one thing in the world he had never learned to stand. If a story has ever made you sit up straighter than you meant to, do something for me before you go any further. Drop the name of your town in the comments, your real one, the one on the highway sign, because I want to know how far this travels across this country. And stay to the end, because what happened on the 900-meter line 2 days later changed how a few hundred soldiers understood the word strength, and it has very little to do with strength at all. It is worth understanding before anything else what kind of man Bramwell was, because the story does not work if you imagine a cartoon. He was not stupid. He was, by any honest measure, the best service rifle shot in the Canadian Armed Forces, and he had the hardware to prove it. 4 straight years as top overall at the Small Arms Concentration, a wall of the Queen's Medal, and the commanding officer's commendations, a reputation thick enough that younger soldiers straightened up when his name came over the loudspeaker. He was 6'3" and built like a man who treated the gym as a moral obligation, and he shot the way he lived by overwhelming the problem. His doctrine, if you could call it that, was aggression and repetition. He fired his sighters fast, chased the fall of shot, slammed in his correction, and bullied the target into submission before conditions could turn on him. It worked because he was strong and quick, and because for 15 years, nobody on a Canadian range had been good enough to make him wait. Waiting was the thing he could not do. The narrator wants to be precise about this, because it is the entire mechanism of what is coming. Royce Bramwell could not be patient, and at distance, patience is everything. Wren Mercer was 31 years old, a sergeant in a reserve infantry regiment out of southwestern Ontario. And in her civilian life, she was 4 months from defending a doctoral thesis in applied mathematics on the modeling of turbulent boundary layers, which is to say she spent her weekdays describing in equations most people will never see exactly how moving air tumbles and shears and lies. The irony was not lost on her. During the week, she modeled wind on a screen and could not predict it. On a Saturday at 1,000 meters, she could feel it move through the mirage, like a sentence she already knew the end of. She had learned the second thing long before the first. Her grandfather, Emmett, had been a full-bore rifle competitor at the Connaught, and Bisley meets for 40 years, and a provincial land surveyor for 30 of them, and he had put a transit and a rifle into her hands in the same childhood summer and taught her that they were the same instrument. Both of them, he said, were ways of telling the truth about a distance you couldn't touch. He taught her trigonometry on the firing point before she ever saw it in a classroom. He taught her to range a far hillside by the width of a fence post in a scope. He taught her that the wind doesn't lie, people do, and that a shot you take in anger you have already missed. He had been gone 3 years, a stroke quietly in his armchair, with a ballistics card still in his shirt pocket, and Wren still heard him most clearly in the half-second before a shot broke, which was the only place she had left to keep him. The annual concentration at Connaught was on paper a marksmanship competition. In practice, it was a status engine. Careers were noticed there. Sniper cells and special operations selection cadres sent quiet observers there every year, people whose presence was logged as range liaison and whose actual job was to find a specific and unteachable quality: composure under a clock, the ability to think when the body is screaming, that no performance review has ever captured. This year there were 3 such observers, and the senior of them was a lieutenant colonel named Della Voss, who had spent 23 years in places that do not appear on her official record, and who set down her coffee on the second morning to watch a reservist she had not been told to watch. The woman who had put Wren's name on the entry list was Warrant Officer Bev Cardinal, the reserve team's coach, a wiry Cree woman from northern Manitoba who had shot competitively for 2 decades and filed 2 complaints against Bramwell over the years, both of which had gone exactly nowhere. Bev had heard the calculator's line. She found Wren at the cleaning bench afterward, running a bore snake through the C7, the data book back on the table, smoothed flat. "You good," Bev said. "I'm good. You heard him, I heard him." Wren set the rifle down. The whole base heard him. "That's the point of him." Bev studied her the way she'd learned to study shooters over 20 years. Not for what they said, but for where they carried the weight. The shoulders, the jaw, the hands. Wren's hands were steady, and she had gone back and copied 2 of Bramwell's morning corrections into the back of her own book, without comment, because she was already studying him, already turning him into data. "He's going to come for you specifically," Bev said. "You know that. Not just on the score sheet. He's going to try to get into your head before you ever lie down on the same point. I know. So get somewhere he can't reach." Wren tapped 2 fingers against her own temple, the way Emmett used to, and went back to the bore. It is hard to overstate how fast a small base talks. By the noon meal on the first day, every relay knew there was a reservist in the long-range matches who had no business being competitive and was, irritatingly competitive. She had shot the 300-meter deliberate, with a score that made the scorers check it twice. Her grouping at 500 was so tight, the butts party signaled it slowly, the way they do when they want the line to look. The soldiers who looked her up, and on a base, someone always looks you up. Found a reservist with a sniper qualification she'd earned on a course where she'd graded top of a class of regular force candidates, and a record that, in the places it was readable, was very good. Those soldiers got quiet. The ones who didn't bother looking made up their minds in the 2 seconds it took to register a woman and a Maple Leaf Reserve flash, and those were the loudest at lunch. And the narrator notes, without much surprise, that loudness and ignorance were once again traveling together as they so often do. Her first head-to-head match came against a regular force corporal named Del Hutchins, a decent shot with a wrestler's build who had clearly decided to be gentle about it. He told her quietly on the walk, to the point that he wasn't going to take it easy on her, and he said it kindly, almost apologetically, like a warning. "Good," she said. "Don't." They shot the 500. It was not that Wren was a faster shooter than Hutchins. It was that she was faster at the only thing that mattered, which was knowing when not to shoot. Twice the wind picked up off the left, and Hutchins, on his rhythm, sent rounds into it and watched them drift a hand's width. Both times Wren held her shot, let the gust pass through, read the flat in the mirage, and broke the trigger into still air. She won going away. Hutchins sat up off the mat, looked downrange at his own scattered group, and wore the specific expression of a man recalculating something he thought he'd already solved. By the end of the first day, Wren had won 3 matches, and the base was talking about nothing else, which meant that across the messes and the cleaning benches and the smoke pit, the conversation kept bending toward the same 2 names, because the brackets had been posted and arithmetic is arithmetic. If she kept winning, she landed in Bramwell's match on the final morning. Bramwell read the board at the equipment tent with a paper coffee cup going cold in his hand and a corporal named Jas Sandu. 26, careful, one of the few in Bramwell's orbit who had never quite swallowed the arrangement, watched the Master Warrant's face do something it didn't usually do in public. It went still, not angry, stiller than angry, the particular stillness of a man whose story about the world has just hit a variable it didn't account for, and who is deciding in real time whether to revise the story or break the variable. "She wins her afternoon match. She's on my point tomorrow," Bramwell said to no one. "You'll handle it," said Hutchins, who had lost to her and was now standing near Bramwell because that was where it was safe to stand. "I'll handle it," Bramwell agreed, and the way he said it made Jas Sandu set his own coffee down and not pick it back up. That night, while most of the base wound down, Wren sat on the floor of the reserve team's allotted hut, with the printout of Bramwell's competition record from the last 4 years spread across the boards around her. Bev had pulled it for her that afternoon. It was 16 pages, and Wren read every page twice, and what she was looking for she found on a single line near the end. His one recorded loss, 3 years gone, against an old chief warrant officer since retired, in conditions described in the report as severe switching wind at 900. The note was almost an afterthought. Bramwell had lost because his opponent refused to chase. The old chief had shot slow, taken let-offs, declined to react to a fishtailing wind that Bramwell kept correcting into, and let the master warrant's own aggression scatter his group across the scoring rings while the chief put his rounds, unhurried, into the center. Bramwell had beaten himself. Patience had killed him. Wren set the page down and lay back on the cold floor and looked at the ceiling and let Emmett's voice come, the way it came in the quiet places. The wind doesn't lie, he'd said, in a fish hut, in a duck blind, on a survey line, on the 1,000-yard mound, at Connaught with his hand on her small shoulder. People lie. Targets don't lie. The rifle is the most honest thing you will ever hold. So be worthy of it. She'd been 11. She was 31. He'd been gone 3 years, and she still heard him most clearly when the distance was longest, as if he'd arranged it that way, knowing she'd need him at range. Across the base, in the visiting officers' quarters, Lieutenant Colonel Della Voss was having a short conversation with her 2 colleagues about what they had watched that day. She said one word, Mercer, and the other 2 nodded, and she said she wanted to see the final before she decided anything, but the way she set down her cup told both of them she had already decided most of it. Outside, past the lit windows, the long-range firing point lay empty under a clear, cold, prairie-bright Ottawa sky, the target frames standing in the dark at 900 meters like patient witnesses, waiting for morning. The morning of the final arrived the way trouble arrives on a base, quietly, and then all at once. By 6, the whole concentration knew 2 facts, that the reservist had gone undefeated, and that she and Bramwell were on the same point at 1000 hours, and the 2 facts together made a specific weather in the air. A thing you could feel in how people held their coffee and in how a conversation died when the wrong person walked past. Jas Sandhu had not slept well, and at 5:45, staring at the ceiling, he stopped pretending it was the cot. It was Bramwell. It was the way the master warrant had looked at the board the night before. Jas had been around enough men with enough unchecked authority to recognize the expression, not rage, but the cold administrative calm of a man who has decided an outcome and is now arranging the conditions to deliver it. He got up and found Hutchins at the wash station. You talked to him this morning, Jas said. Hutchins, who filled silences automatically, did not fill this one. That alone told Jas the answer. Briefly, Hutchins finally said, He's focused. How focused? Like I've never seen. Up at 4, ran the canal road in the dark. Been dry firing in the bay since 5. Hutchins paused, and when he went on his voice had gone careful. When I came in, he looked at me and said she's not walking off that point with her dignity. And the way he said dignity, Hutchins shook his head. I don't know what today is, Jas. I don't. Jas filed it the way he'd been trained to file information. Cleanly, without editorializing, and thought about going to find Bev Cardinal, and thought about doing something, and then thought about Royce Bramwell's reach, and what it could do to a corporal's career, and went to get breakfast instead. It was a decision he would turn over for a long time afterward. Wren was on the long point at 6:15, not shooting, not even rigged, sitting cross-legged at the edge of the mound with her eyes closed and her palms open on her knees, breathing on a slow count, looking less like a competitor than like a person who had found a quiet room inside herself that no one else had the key to. Bev arrived at 6:20 with 2 coffees and stopped when she saw the posture, because in 20 years she had seen every pre-match ritual there was, pacing, music, prayer, anger, silence, and she had learned to read them the way you read flags. Wren's stillness told her one specific thing, that the storm had already happened, somewhere in the night while everyone slept, and what was left now was not preparation. It was waiting. Bev sat down and held out a coffee. How'd you sleep? 4 hours. Enough. Reynolds, Bev caught herself. Old name, wrong war, wrong story. Bramwell was in the bay at 5. I heard. Base talk sip. He's scared. Bramwell doesn't get scared. Everyone gets scared, Wren said mild. The ones who can't say it out loud turn it into something else. He's turned it into rage, which means he'll push harder at 900 than he's ever pushed. And the wind out there today is going to switch, and a man pushing hard into a switching wind makes the one mistake you can't take back at distance. She drank her coffee. He'll chase it. I'll wait for it. Bev was quiet a moment. And you? What are you out here for? Wren looked out at the flags, 3 of them strung down the range, the near one, and the middle one and the far one, already disagreeing with each other in the early light, which is the kind of thing that ruins a man's whole day if he doesn't see it coming. Granddad used to say the only shooter you can't beat is the one with nothing to prove, she said. The one who shows up to do the work and go home. She turned. I don't have anything to prove. I proved it yesterday. He called me litter in front of my peers on a range where I serve. She didn't harden when she said it. Her voice went quieter, which was worse. I'm not here to make a point of him. I'm here because this is where I'm supposed to be, and he doesn't get to decide that for me. Nobody does. Bev looked at her for a long moment, then picked up her own coffee. Okay, she said. Just that. Okay. And somehow the single word carried more than a speech. The crowd for the final was the largest in the meet's long memory at Connaught. Soldiers who'd pulled duty the day before had swapped shifts to be on the firing line by 10. Civilian range staff drifted to the rope. Even the 3 liaison officers, who had kept a careful professional distance, stood closer to the point than they had all week, and Della Voss had her arms uncrossed. Bramwell arrived at 9:15 and did not walk on the way he usually walked, loose and proprietary. He walked the way a machine moves, economical locked. He'd cut the sleeves off his shirt, and his shoulders moved with a density that made a few watching soldiers trade glances. He looked at the crowd. He did not look at Wren. Jazz, 15 meters back, marked that and felt his stomach drop. Because Bramwell always eyeballed his opponent in the warm-up, always made a meal of it, always demonstrated ownership of the space before a round was sent. Refusing to look at her meant she was already inside him, taking up so much room he couldn't afford to put his eyes on her directly. The format for the final was a long-range deliberate at 900 meters, head-to-head, equal rounds, highest aggregate with a count of central hits to break a tie, shot under whatever the morning gave them. What the morning gave them was the worst possible thing, which is a wind that looks easy. There was a steady seeming push from the left, 8 or 10 kilometers an hour, the kind of value a confident shooter dials and forgets. But the narrator wants you to see what Wren saw and Bramwell did not, which was that the 3 flags were lying to each other. The near flag stood firm at half-mast left. The middle flag, 400 meters out, hung slacker and kept dropping toward the pole and lifting again. And the far flag, near the butts, was doing something almost coy, lifting from the right for a breath or two and falling back. A boundary layer is not one wind. It is many winds stacked and shearing, and Wren had spent 3 years describing exactly this on a screen and her whole life feeling it in her cheekbone. The bullet would fly through all 3 of those winds in its second and a half of travel. And the man who dialed the obvious left value and trusted it was going to watch his rounds wander. The range safety officer, Chief Warrant Officer Lorne Pruitt, 54 30 years in, the kind of man who had said every important thing so many times he no longer decorated any of it, called the 2 shooters forward and ran the safety brief in a flat voice with his eyes mostly on one of them. Controlled fire. Each shot on the command. Any unsafe act, any muzzle off the danger area, you're done, no appeal. He said it to both of them and meant it for one. Then he had them lie down on adjacent points, and the line went quiet. And somewhere in the crowd, a 19-year-old private from a town in the eastern townships named Cody Lemieux, who had joined because his grandfather had served and who had until yesterday believed, without malice, simply because no one had shown him otherwise, that there was a natural ceiling on what a woman could do with a rifle, leaned forward without knowing he had. Bramwell shot the way. Bramwell shot. He fired his sighters fast, watched the spotting disc come up low and left of center, and the narrator can tell you exactly what happened in his head because it had worked 10,000 times. More left wind than expected. Correct hard, dominate. He wound on windage, sent another, watched it come up high right because the middle flag had let off mid-flight and the wind he'd just dialed for wasn't there anymore. He swore, low, into his cheekpiece. He corrected again the other way, chasing the disc around the target the way a man chases his own reflection in a funhouse, and the crowd, which had come expecting a coronation, went quiet in a way that had teeth in it. He was strong and he was fast and he was, round by round, beating himself exactly the way the 16th page of his own record said he would. Wren did not chase anything. She shot one sighter, read the disc, and then did something that several soldiers in the front would describe afterward, and not quite be able to explain. She waited. For 90 seconds she lay behind the rifle and did not fire, watching the far flag, watching the boil of the mirage through her scope flatten and run and flatten, holding for the let-off she knew was coming, because air that picks up that way always pays it back. The line got restless. Bramwell, 2 meters away, sent another wandering round and heard her not shooting, and it aided him worse than a good shot would have, because he had built his whole career on rattling men into reacting, and the woman beside him was treating his entire existence as weather. When the let-off came, the far flag sagging, the mirage going flat as poured glass for the length of a held breath, she was already there. The trigger broke into still air. Downrange in the pits, the marker ran the disc up dead center, the white spotter sitting in the middle of the black like a planet, and she ran the bolt and did it again and again, central hit after central hit, unhurried, while the man beside her hammered rounds into a wind that would not hold still for him. It is a quiet thing to watch at distance. There is no crack and countercrack, no contact, no clinch. There is only a woman lying very still, and a disc coming up in the middle of a target 900 meters away over and over, and a large strong man 2 meters from her coming apart by degrees, and somehow that quiet was the most violent thing anyone on that line had seen in years of this meet. Halfway through the string, a master corporal in the crowd muttered, to whoever was nearest, the question that would later be the one everyone argued about. Did she beat him, or did he beat himself? And the honest answer, the one Della Voss arrived at, standing 30 meters back with her arms loose at her sides, the one that is worth sitting with, is that there is no difference at distance. The wind exposes what a person already is. Wren's stillness and Bramwell's fury were both just the truth of them, run out to 900 meters and printed on paper for everyone to read. The scorers confirmed it before the last rounds were even fired, because the arithmetic had stopped being close. Wren had the aggregate and the central count besides. Pruitt had begun to lift his hand to call the line clear, and it was in that exact moment, the instant the result became undeniable in front of the largest crowd this range had drawn in 11 years. In front of cameras, the public affairs cell had set up to film a feel-good clip about the meet in front of 3 liaison officers and a chief warrant officer and a 19-year-old from the townships and the corporal who hadn't slept, that Royce Bramwell stopped being a competitor and became a problem. He came up off his mat fast, not to save his weapon. He came up with the rifle in his hands, and in the white of his face there was nothing left of the calculating man. Only something much older and much simpler, and the muzzle of a loaded C7 with a round, still in the chamber, swung up off the danger area as he rose and turned, and for one obscene fraction of a second it tracked across the firing line, across Pruitt, across the rope, where soldiers stood 3 deep. "Stop dancing and look at me," he said, or started to say, the old taunt that had always worked, and he took a step toward Wren with the rifle still live and still wandering. On emotion now and nothing else, 100 kilograms of humiliated man holding a loaded weapon with no idea anymore where it was pointed. Pruitt was already shouting cease fire. Jas was already moving and would not get there. Della Voss had taken a step she did not remember taking, and Wren Mercer, who had been raised by a man who believed the entire point of the rifle was to tell the truth and never ever to threaten, did the thing she had been trained to do across 1,000 hours of drills and 1 course she had topped and 2 decades of a grandfather's quiet voice. She did not freeze, and she did not flinch, and she did not reach for her own weapon. She came up inside Bramwell's arc, where his size could not be brought to bear, and her hands found the rifle the way her hands had always found rifles, with a precision that looked almost gentle, and in one continuous motion that the cameras would later have to slow down for people to follow. She rolled the muzzle up and away from every living person on that line, stripped the weapon out of his grip by levering against the weakness of his thumb, dropped the magazine, and racked the live round clear so that it spun out and landed in the dirt with a small sound that in the total silence, everyone somehow heard. Bramwell, his weapon suddenly gone and his balance committed forward into the space where it had been, kept coming, and she took his wrist and turned it to the angle the joint was built to refuse and put him down. Controlled, deliberate, the physics of his own momentum, doing the work her grandfather had taught her to let momentum do. Onto the mat, face down, the now empty rifle already locked open in her other hand and laid flat and pointing at nothing. It took perhaps 4 seconds. The crack everyone remembered afterward was not a bone. It was the snap of the bolt, locking back on an empty chamber, the cleanest, most final sound a rifle makes. And then there was nothing, no sound at all, from several hundred people for 3 full seconds, the kind of silence that has weight and texture, while a man who had owned this range for 15 years lay still under the hand of a reservist he'd called Litter, and the loaded round he had been swinging at the firing line sat shining in the dirt where she'd cleared it. Wren held him there exactly long enough, not a second longer. She was breathing on the same slow count she'd shot on. The moment Pruitt and a range safety NCO had hands on Bramwell, she let go and stepped back and made his weapon and her own safe with the unhurried hands of someone for whom this was simply the next correct procedure, and then she stood 3 feet from the man on the ground and looked at him. She did not look at him in triumph. There was no performance in it at all. She looked at him the way you look at something that has just become irreversibly real. Not a rival, not a story, a person who had nearly killed someone and would have to live inside that. And she understood the weight of it in a way that had nothing to do with having won. She had had every opportunity to humiliate him, and she had taken none of them. She had used the smallest amount of force the situation allowed and not 1 ounce past it. She had cleared the round, controlled the threat, and stopped. That restraint, more than the impossible string of central hits, more than the takedown, was the thing that traveled. Because the cameras had caught all of it, and a soldier on the rope had caught it too. And within the hour the clip was moving the way fire moves in dry grass, finding the pathways, jumping the gaps. A private group, then a public post, then a veterans forum, then a national outlet that recognized that 40 seconds of footage held more genuine human drama than anything that had come across the desk in weeks. By that evening it had 1 million views. The technical analysts, retired shooters, a former national team coach, were close to unanimous. Most trained people, given a loaded weapon swinging toward a crowd 2 meters away, would have flinched back. The decision to move in and clear and control rather than retreat was, said one of them, either extraordinarily trained or extraordinarily instinctive, and in his professional opinion it was both. But the piece that spread furthest was not the clear and not the takedown. It was the 4 seconds after, the woman standing 3 feet from the man on the ground, looking at him without contempt. The empty rifle pointed at nothing in her hand. People who had already decided how they felt about women in combat roles, for or against, watched those 4 seconds and felt something that did not fit the position they had already taken. And that is the most uncomfortable and useful thing a piece of footage can do. In a bungalow in Brandon, Manitoba, a 73-year-old man named Roland Sears, who had served in a peacekeeping rotation in a country he still couldn't talk about, and who had held certain opinions about women and rifles for 50 years without ever once being made to examine them, watched the clip 4 times and then phoned his daughter, who had been trying to have this conversation with him since before the pandemic. She answered on the 2nd ring. "I watched the thing," he said. "The one with the reservist on the long range." "I know, Dad. I sent it to you. I know you did." He was quiet a while. "I think maybe I owe you an apology for some things I said." She didn't say anything for a moment, and then she said, "Okay, Dad, okay." He said, "That call happened in thousands of versions across the country that week. Not most homes, not even many, but thousands. In Brandon and Trois-Rivières and Corner Brook and Prince George. And the narrator mentions it because a thing that rearranges even one stubborn old belief has done more work than most monuments." The investigation took 72 hours and was, given the footage, a formality. Pruitt walked Wren through the final exchange in a plain office with a legal pad he never wrote on, and at the end he told her the finding, which ran 3 sentences, that Sergeant Mercer had responded to a loaded weapon brought to bear in an unsafe manner, that her response was proportional to the threat and had very likely prevented a fatality on the line, and that no fault attached to her. Bramwell received a formal reprimand, the suspension of his instructor duties, and a referral to a conduct review. And his representative put out a statement that evening, implying the whole thing had been distorted by the attention. Pruitt read it and set it aside without a word. Wren read it standing in Bev's office and set it aside the same way. "You're not going to say anything publicly," Bev said. It wasn't quite a question. "No." Wren looked at the wall, where Bev had pinned a faded photo of an old 1,000-yard mound. "I didn't clear that round to make a point. I cleared it because he gave me no other choice. If I start making statements, I turn it into something it wasn't. It was 4 seconds of doing my job. The rest of it, the video, the politics, that isn't mine. I'm not going to claim it." She paused. Before he left, she added, almost to herself, "Pruitt asked me how I felt, and I told him the truth. I regret that it was Bramwell. I don't regret stopping him." Bev was quiet for a moment. "Your granddad taught you that too." "He taught me the strongest thing you can say is usually nothing," Wren said. "If the only reason you'd speak is for the room." She was quiet, and then, because it was the first time she'd ever said it out loud to anyone, since the armchair and the ballistics card, she said, "He was everything." And she felt the specific lightness of setting down a weight you've carried so long you stopped feeling it, just long enough to notice the difference. Bev didn't try to fill the silence that came after. She just let it be. It was 11 months later, at the regimental anniversary mess dinner in a hall, hung with old battle honors and older photographs, that the last of it closed. Wren was there in her number ones, having that spring been quietly selected by a board chaired by a lieutenant colonel named Della Voss for an advanced marksmanship instructor cadre, the kind of posting that does not get announced ahead of time and is not, the narrator will note, the consolation prize anyone had expected for a reservist. She had just finished a few words at the lectern when a man crossed the hall toward the front, and the room understood who it was before he reached the light, and went still, because everyone there had watched the clip, and everyone knew these two names, and no one had expected this. Royce Bramwell walked with a limp now. A controlled hand had spared his life on the line, but the wrist she'd turned had needed surgery, and something in his gait would carry the memory of that morning permanently. He had done a great deal of interior reconstruction in 11 months, and it was plain on his face, still living in the middle of the work. He stopped 2 meters from her, which everyone present recognized as a deliberate distance, and asked, into the silence, if he could say something. Wren looked at him for a moment, then held out the microphone. He took it. "My name is Master Warrant Officer Royce Bramwell," he said, his voice steady. "Most of you know who I am. Most of you know why." He didn't have notes. He hadn't prepared remarks. He had prepared himself, which is harder. "I was wrong," he said. "Not just on the line, before the line. For 15 years, I told myself, strength was something you prove by making other people smaller, and I was wrong in a way that nearly killed somebody and cost me my career and a wrist that doesn't bend right and a long time alone figuring out who I actually am when there's no one to perform for." He looked at her directly, without deflection. "Sergeant Mercer, what you did on that point wasn't just correct. It was merciful. You had every reason to make me a story, and you refused to. You cleared the round, you stopped the threat, and you stopped." He paused. "I've thought about those 4 seconds more than I've thought about anything in my life." And then, in front of the regiment and the old photographs and the honors on the wall, he extended his hand. The hall held its breath. Wren looked at his hand and then at his face and read it the way she read everything, not with suspicion and not with charity, but with the plain, accurate attention of someone trained to see what is there rather than what she expects. What was there was real. She took his hand. The room let go of its breath, and the applause that followed was not the applause of people who'd been entertained. It was the older, rougher sound of people who had watched something rearrange, by a little, their idea of what change looks like and how long it takes and what it costs. In the back row, a young master corporal, who had been a private from the townships 11 months earlier, who had leaned forward without meaning to on a firing line and had not been able to lean back the same person, felt a thing shift in his chest that he had a name for now, because he'd felt it enough times in the past year, the feeling of a belief widening to hold something it hadn't been built to hold. It had never once been comfortable. It was the most important thing he had ever felt. Afterward, in the corridor, Bev found her. "How do you feel?" Wren thought about it honestly. "Like something finished," she said. "Not ended. Finished. There's a difference." She was quiet, and then a small real smile moved across her face, not for anyone's benefit, just a private truth made briefly visible. "Granddad would have hated the cameras," she said. "He'd have been mortified by the whole circus, but he'd have understood the handshake. He always said, the measure of a shooter isn't the score. It's what you do with the quiet after the last round." She looked down the corridor at the life, moving in all directions around the moment. "I think I finally know what he meant," she said. And then, Wren Mercer, sergeant, mathematician, granddaughter of a man who taught her that the rifle is the most honest thing you will ever hold, and that you had better be worthy of it, stood up straight, and breathed out, and walked into the rest of it. Not as a clip or a cause or a case number, but as herself, which was, in the end, the only thing she had ever been trying to be, and it turned out that was more than enough.